Welcome, on behalf of the Board of Directors of Discovery Space, to our second conversation in a series we are calling Nights to Discover. If you are unfamiliar with our organization, Discovery Space is a hands-on science center and makerspace located in State College, Pennsylvania. We provide STEM education to children and families across a dozen rural counties. Due to COVID-19, we are unable to have the Science Center open. However, our educators are busy facilitating immersive online programming for kids. Like many other nonprofits, our annual fundraising dinner, Night to Discover, was also canceled this year. In its place, we have turned to the virtual world to curate a series of Zoom webinars that we hope have the feel of a fireside chat. Many thanks to our generous sponsors, Geisinger, Penn State Health, Yorish Popik, and Center I Physicians and Surgeons. We are recording this webinar, and we will follow up with the link sharing the recording with all of you. I'd like at this time to invite our presenters to join me on screen. Hi.
Hi.
Penny Noyce is a doctor, an advocate for science education, a writer, and a publisher. She studied biochemistry at Harvard and medicine at Stanford. She practiced internal medicine at a community health center in Boston for several years, but increasingly became involved in science education in and out of school. As her older children set off for college, Penny began writing for middle grade children until eventually she fused her love of science, kids, and great writing into a nonprofit company, publishing science books for young people called Tumble Home. Dr. Leo Liu, who happens to be Penny's husband, is an infectious disease physician and scientist entrepreneur who currently works as a clinical consultant at several hospitals in the greater Boston area and as an editor for ProMed, the internet-based global reporting network for infectious disease outbreaks. Leo has worked as a frontline responder during emerging epidemics, including Ebola in Sierra Leone and COVID-19 here in the US. Here's how the hour will go. I will pose questions to the presenters to start off the conversations. We will also be accepting your questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Discovery Space's board chair, Dr. Eva Pell, will collect questions to pose to our presenters later in the webinar. Let's begin. Thank you for being with us today, Penny and Leo. At our first Nights to Discover event, we talked with scientists studying COVID-19 from the perspective of developing treatments and studying wildlife-related epidemiology of the disease. Tonight, we want to talk with you two about the frontline human elements and implications of the disease. So Penny, I'd like to start by asking you how you and Leo met, how those early years and your shared interests have shaped your trajectory, and then Leo, you're welcome to sort of jump in and share your perspective as well.
Well, Leo and I met at orientation day for Stanford Medical School. And we actually ended up living in the same house and studied together for all the years of medical school. We were good friends. I went with Leo on a 6-week trip to China in our final year. And then we went off to our separate residency programs, him in Boston and me in Minneapolis. And then we started dating while we were living, 1,500 miles apart. So we got married after medical school, after residency, and he went on in infectious diseases. One of the things I always loved about Leo was his sense of adventure. And that has allowed us to do a lot of travel. And sometimes he's gone off to some of these more dangerous adventures like Ebola without me. I did practice community medicine in Boston for several years, but Leo and I ended up having 5 children. And somewhere in there, I was cutting back on my medical time. And I also I helped found the Noyce Foundation, which was a foundation established in my father's will in 1990. And for 25 years, we worked on improving science and math education in the US and primarily, or especially in out of school settings, like museums. And then in the middle of that, or about 12 years ago, as our children were getting older, I decided to return to my very first love, which was writing. And I started writing books for children. that led eventually to starting Tumble Home, where we've now published over 50 books, and I write a few of them and I edit all of them. So I get to see a lot of great writing for kids about science.
I think I would simply add that some of the adventures that Penny and I have shared together may be relevant to tonight's conversation. She and I both took time off from late in our residency and worked actually in northern India at a refugee hospital for Tibetan refugees, where we saw a lot of tuberculosis. Later during a sabbatical year in London, while I was doing laboratory parasitology, Penny took advantage of that time to get an advanced degree in tropical medicine at the London School for Tropical Medicine and Health. Later that year, we actually took a family trip to visit Penny's sister, who lives in Kenya. And that was, I think, my first real introduction to Africa, which was useful when I got to go back to Africa sometime later during one of the Ebola outbreaks there.
Yeah, we've been to a lot of interesting places. Leo has also traveled and given sort of health advice to the World Wildlife Fund in Nepal and Bhutan. So he's seen a fair amount of medicine in developing countries. Also, during medical school, Leo spent 6 months in China teaching English and taking learning medicine from his doctor students in Nanjing. That's where Leo delivered lots and lots of Chinese babies.
Wow, thanks. Leo, I'd love to hear more. You've worked on the front lines in Africa on Ebola and among other very serious infectious diseases. Were there insights from this work that you felt important to share with your children, or did any of these stories make it into Penny's books?
Yes, they did. I mean, I didn't know they were going to end up in one of Penny's books at the time, but I think it did provide a lot of material. And since Penny's really very familiar with the kind of work I do and the underlying science and the implications for the broader public, she always followed what I did abroad with great interest. I'll actually, for the benefit of the audience, I'll show just a few pictures from my time abroad. Hopefully you'll all be able to see this. These are a few pictures from a typical Ebola treatment unit during the really great pandemic of Ebola in West Africa in 2014, 2015. And I think a number of you may be familiar with these kinds of scenes. Ebola, of course, is a very horrific disease, quite ripe for very dramatic news stories of that sort. And it is quite an extraordinary experience to take care of these very sick patients for a disease that has about 50% mortality, and having to do so in what look like spacesuits, basically total body so-called personal protection equipment, or PPE, and doing that for hours at a time in a tropical 100-degree weather setting. Let's just see if I can get the next slide over. Sorry about that. I'm trying to just get...
Next slide.
Yeah, there we go. During that time, I actually also had the opportunity to work in a general hospital as opposed to an Ebola treatment unit. And I also got to go out with many of the so-called contact tracers in 4x4 vehicles, workers from the World Health Organization. And that broadened my perspective a lot in ways that I think are probably relevant to our current COVID pandemic. And it may be hard to appreciate this from the media coverage, but actually taking care of patients by itself is only a small part of actually controlling an epidemic. Other features are probably more important, and these are 6 important things that were formulated by one of the leading organizations working there, Doctors Without Borders. The other ones include safe burials, disease surveillance, that is looking for the appearance of new cases, contact tracing, which is all important, going out and finding all the contacts, the friends and relatives of patients that you've actually identified in order to identify and isolate new cases, taking care of all the other things that are going on during a system or under a healthcare system that's being stressed under conditions of a pandemic. And then we have here awareness raising, and I would actually put that at the top. Raising awareness among the public, educating the public about the nature of the disease, the nature of its transmission, and most importantly, what each individual can do to try to actually halt the spread of the infection. Lastly, I would say this was true of Ebola, and it's actually also true of COVID-19. The vast majority of these new infections, well, they have to come from somewhere, and if they don't come from humans, they come from somewhere in the animal kingdom. And I think this audience learned a lot about that, the so-called One Health concept during the first session with Peter Hudson. So those are my remarks about, and let me just see if I can get back to stopping sharing the screen. Here we go.
Yeah. Yes. So Leo was off in Ebola land for 6 weeks, and people asked me whether I was worried, or asked him, why did your wife let you go? But I knew that it was really a good place for him to go with all his the skills and interests that he's had for a long time. But I think one of the things that Leo particularly appreciated was working in the general hospital, whereas in the Ebola treatment wards, what you could do was very restricted and limited and kind of cookbook. In the regular hospitals were very, very understaffed because staff had either died from Ebola or run away from Ebola. And so he was seeing a lot of things that have shown up in a couple of my books, like babies dying of malaria, the fact that to get an X-ray, they put the patients in the bus and sent them off with a lunch to a place, I don't know, an hour away, and then they would come back with their X-rays on their laps. And also the concept that nowhere in Sierra Leone is there an ICU. Nobody's going to be intubated and saved by advanced medicine. They're just going to be hydrated and, watched and cared for. And at that time, there was very, very little in the way of medicine for Ebola. And that has changed a little bit, which also comes up in one of my books.
Actually, Penny, you remind me of something, which is that, the healthcare volunteers that come from the West, from Europe and the United States and Canada, they get more than their fair share of media coverage, at least in our countries. But the fact is that, the vast majority of the work being done in these endemic and native countries, of course, are being done by the local doctors and the local nurses. They were much, much better and much more attuned to what sort of the art of the possible, meaning, what can you do for patients with limited resources you have at hand? And part of my sort of education in leading teams of at least American volunteers was just getting them acculturated to working in a low resource environment, to which many of them were completely unaccustomed. The sort of shock entry sentence that I would use is, in this country, yes, there's not a single ICU bed. We have this concept of not in America, when patients have a terminal illness, of invoking so-called do not resuscitate orders, so-called DNR. It's an abbreviation that all doctors use. And what I would tell these American healthcare workers who are new to a third world country is that everyone in a poor country like this is DNR from the day they're born and for their entire lives. And that was just a way of shocking them into this reality.
Wow. I would like to, Leo, ask you to tell us a little bit about your work with COVID-19 on the front lines. And then Penny, we know from working at our science center that parents and teachers are working hard to keep their children safe and doing the best to explain the disease to them in a way they can understand. I'd like to hear how sort of your books can help do that.
Sure. Do you want to go first, Leo?
Sure, I'll go first. I do work part-time as a infectious disease clinician. And in fact, here in the Boston area, we are seeing a resurgence of COVID patients. So today was a day that I was at work, and you can see I'm still here in the hospital. It's been a very busy day. I saw about 16 patients today between a couple of hospitals, about half of whom have COVID. So it is very much a reality, at least for me. And I guess you could say that I'm in the trenches right here in America. Rather than try to share the screen and get into glitches, I'd rather just tell you sort of my 300-degree experience with COVID. First and perhaps foremost, Michelle mentioned that I'm an editor for ProMed. ProMed is short for the Program for Monitoring Emerging Diseases. And it's basically about a 25-year-old virtual network of disease experts, doctors, epidemiologists, public health specialists, and veterinarians. About 50 of us distributed around the world who basically look for local news of outbreaks or cases of unusual diseases that have the potential to spread elsewhere and become epidemics. We don't operate through official channels, and yet we provide expert commentary. And so we tend to be a very rapid and yet robust way of informing the rest of the world. And it was on New Year's Eve, 2019, actually, when my colleague, moderator and editor who was on duty, picked up a notice of this unexplained outbreak of pneumonia coming from Wuhan. And we posted that on December 31, 2019, and that was the first notice of what became known as the COVID-19 pandemic to the rest of the world. Likewise, we were, for the same reasons, we were the first organization to report to the rest of the world the first outbreak of SARS, predecessor of the SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID-19, MERS, and pretty much every outbreak of Ebola. So as editor for ProMed, I was watching this virus jump from China to East Asia to Southeast Asia, then to Europe, and then to other countries. So it's no surprise when it hit our shores, first to Washington State with dominantly a Chinese version of the virus, but then here on the East Coast with predominantly European strains of the virus that have been through Europe and France. So moving into my other role as an infectious disease clinician, I was we were all pretty quickly overwhelmed with this huge wave of COVID-19 patients that even though we knew they were coming, I don't think any of us were quite prepared to handle that. And I speak not only as individuals, but also from the standpoint of healthcare institutions and big and small hospitals. So I have since seen hundreds of COVID patients, but after that very first wave of taking care of COVID patients, finally I actually became a patient myself. And I came down with COVID after taking care of that first wave of patients. For me, fortunately, it was a relatively mild illness, pretty typical symptoms of what you've heard about, dry cough, headache, fever, extreme weakness that lasted for about a week. One thing that happened to me, which was very, very distinctive, was completely losing my sense of smell. And the tip-off for that was when I was trying to have a glass of wine with my dinner, and I couldn't smell anything at all. And I was scheduling myself to have a COVID test the next morning, but I already knew it was going to be positive because that loss of sense of smell is so distinctive and specific for this particular infection. As a result of having COVID, I now have plenty of antibodies. And so my ongoing experience having been a patient with COVID is actually being a donor for the so-called COVID convalescent plasma because our bloodstream is quite rich in antibodies against the virus. It is now 6 months out. I continue to donate convalescent plasma once a month to our Red Cross, which very helpfully sends me a text message about every month that my convalescent plasma is much in demand, in part because I have a relatively rare blood type for the United States. So I think even if I weren't seeing patients as a doctor, this is a kind of a vivid reminder of both that I had COVID and that there's an ongoing need for treating patients who still have COVID.
Do you think it works?
That's a really difficult question. In principle, it really should work. People have probably heard of remdesivir, which is a new antivirus specifically against coronavirus. And in my personal experience, I do think that this antivirus medicine works. As far as the plasma is concerned, yes, in principle, it should have the same mechanism of action. That is by glomming onto the virus, and it essentially neutralizes it, and you want to reduce the total burden or the total number of viruses that are circulating in the bloodstream before they have the opportunity to actually damage your organs, such as the lungs and so forth. So in principle, certainly plasma that contains lots of antibodies against the virus should be helpful. It's been more difficult for us to see that in practice. There may be some variations from batch to batch. There are certain patients for whom we cannot use this. There are patients who, for other reasons, cannot get remdesivir, and they are often sicker. And therefore, we are using the convalescent plasma more as a last-ditch effort. So it may not be surprising that we're not seeing great outcomes in those patients because they're probably already very, very sick with the virus and perhaps too late for a treatment directed against the virus itself to be very effective. Still, there's every reason to believe that it can and should work, and so I can see why the Red Cross is still collecting plasma for people like me.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about my reaction to the question that Michelle asked. I was very interested, like Leo, in this disease as it was first showing up, and I spent a lot of time perusing worldometers, watching how the number of infections was gradually increasing in different countries around the world. I was talking to a friend of mine who has been working a lot with teaching young children or middle grade children about data. And we both talked about how much there was to learn about data from this pandemic, this epidemic that became a pandemic, because there was new, real, important data to be looked at every day. So we decided that we would develop a program about that. And the idea was that I would, now I'm supposed to share my screen, but I just did the wrong thing, would write a book, and she would write data activities that went with it. So let me see if I can get out of here and show you a picture of the book, which is called, it's called The Case of the COVID Crisis. And it's part of a series that we have at Tumblehome, which is called the Galactic Academy of Science series. And in that series, there's always two middle school kids who end up going on an adventure with the Galactic Academy of Science. Now I have completely done away with my PowerPoint, so it'll take a while for me to find it again. And because they are members of the Galactic Academy of Science, and they have mentors who are teenagers from the future who give them a little handheld time travel device that allows them to go back in time into many different countries to learn about the science that they need for to solve a mystery or a problem they have in the present. So I decided to write a Galactic Academy of Science book about the COVID crisis, in which the kids would be able to travel to many different epidemics throughout history and in different places in the world. So, and a lot of that was inspired and informed by what I had learned from Leo, what we had read together over the years about different epidemics throughout history. And that's really the connection. So I'm just going to show you a couple of pictures from this book. This was really fun because it turned out that the Museum of Science in Boston, Massachusetts, was interested in this idea of starting a book club that would have a book and activities that would go with the book, learning activities. So we ended up running a 9-week program through the Museum of Science. And we started doing it when I only had about 3 chapters written. So it was really kind of a scramble to keep ahead of the program. And not only did I write it, but our person in Taiwan got illustrations for us. So some of the illustrations here you can see at the top left, beyond the picture, beyond the cover, that's from the 1919 flu, those 2 pictures where women are sewing masks. And then below that is a picture of the visit to Taiwan, which has done an incredibly good job of controlling the outbreak. And the next picture over is a picture of Ebola. And then farther right, there are pictures of May and Clinton visiting May's mother on the Diamond Princess cruise ship. And then there are bats, because bats carry an epidemic called Nipah that is very interesting. And so one of the things we try to do in these books is to have them have a little bit of adventure in them, reasonable amount of information in them, certain amount of humor, and a lot of diversity of countries and people and scientists involved. So I just want to show you that we did develop a facilitator's guide for people to do this as a book club, and activities that kids could do either at home, either by hand, like there was a card sorting game to look at how diseases spread, and then a lot of technology-based things and data-based activities. And this was actually the 11th book in our Galactic Academy of Science series. These are just the ones that I've written or co-written, but we've always tried to select topics that might not be in the school curriculum, but that would be cool for kids, like microchips, concussion, foodborne outbreaks, vaccines, that was a few years ago, zombies, and whether they're real, and codes and ciphers. So I tend to, when I start writing these things, I end up often writing about something to do with disease, just because that's obviously an area of interest and expertise for me, where I feel easier than I do writing about semiconductors.
Got it. Thank you for sharing that. So it sounds like a lot of your books are nonfiction. Have you written any fiction that helps get at the issue about disease? If so, how do you hope that this will help expand children's understanding?
Yeah, well, the books that I've told you about are actually fiction, just with a lot of true information in them, a lot of facts. And some of the gas books actually have little pull-out 1-page biographies of some of the scientists that they that they meet, and those are definitely the nonfiction parts of those books. But one of my favorite books that I wrote is called Mosquitoes Don't Bite Me, and it's entirely fiction. The subject is a young half African girl in North Carolina who has the characteristic that for some reason or other, mosquitoes don't like to bite her at all. And the father of a classmate of hers who runs a pharmaceutical company gets interested enough in it to send her with a team to Africa to investigate the genetics of this trait in her father's family. And all is going well, and there's a lot about Africa, which she had left when she was 3 years old. But then she gets kidnapped, and the adventure rises more. But the basis of that book was I wanted to write a book about mosquitoes, and my partner Barnes said nobody wants to read about mosquitoes. Write a book about dinosaurs or sharks. And I thought, well, everybody writes about dinosaurs or sharks. And that's when I started thinking about this idea of mosquitoes don't bite me.
There are a lot of books on dinosaurs and sharks for sure. Leo, so epidemics are nothing new. They've existed for all of recorded history. COVID-19 won't be the last pandemic. So just one more quick question before I ask Eva to join us on screen. What can people do to minimize and manage future outbreaks? You're right there seeing it. Do you have advice for everybody listening?
Well, obviously, a lot could be said, and much has already been said and written about this. I think for me personally, there are a few, I think, lessons learned to address your question that are most important. I think one, I would say, is vigilance. That is, to just be on the lookout for new outbreaks of disease and not restrict yourself, by the way, to humans, but also be looking in animals that may be the source of new infections that then jump into people. That precisely is our charge at ProMed, the Program for Monitoring Emerging Diseases. But this is something that, a broader range of organizations, both public, private, governmental, non-governmental, and perhaps even extending into the realm of citizen science could be doing. So vigilance, I think, is certainly one of them. Another one is developing rapidly the capacity to actually determine that you actually do have this or that infection. Of course, what I'm talking about is developing and deploying diagnostic tests. And you want to do that as soon as possible and make them widely available, ideally free, so that cases can in fact be determined and counted. Identifying the disease is the first step to knowing what's going on, the magnitude of the disease, and what kind of resources that you need to deploy, when, where, and in what quantities to control a new outbreak. So number two, I would say, is diagnostic tests. And then third, I would say respect the science, science in capital letters, which is, of course, what your center is all about, and let real data guide public policy decisions, even if the data, at least temporarily, might be, shall we say, politically unpopular. Personally, I think the ability to use the best available information to protect the largest number of people, your citizens, is one of the real tests of political leadership. So vigilance, developing and deploying diagnostic tests, and respecting the science and going where the science takes you.
Thanks. I would like to now invite Eva Pell to join us and share some questions that have been submitted by our viewers. Eva?
Hi, everybody. Penny and Leo, thank you. It was so much fun to hear you talk to each other and to us. I do have a few more questions that have been coming in, and we want to see what you think about those. Leo, we'll start with you. You talked about Ebola and about COVID. Can you talk a little bit about how they compare? I mean, obviously they have different levels of severity, but they behave differently too.
Yes, I think your audience can actually read about Ebola. You know, the entries in Wikipedia are actually very good, and much has been written that's quite good. And I would recommend, in particular, the natural history writer David Quammen, who wrote a wonderful book about outbreaks and emerging infectious diseases in general. That's called Spillover. And if you just want to read about Ebola, the section on Ebola extracted from that book and then updated is also available as a separate publication. But rather than going into sort of a scientific or medical comparison of the two diseases, I want to just tell you frankly what I think as a clinician and as someone who's responded to both Ebola and COVID-19. And it may be a shocking thing to say, but I would actually take an outbreak of Ebola any day over an outbreak of COVID-19. And it might be shocking to say because Ebola is such a horrific disease, you know, that kills about half of the people it infects. But there are characteristics of Ebola that lend itself to control that are very different from COVID-19. COVID-19 is in so many ways an exception to what we have learned about other nasty viruses. The thing about Ebola is it literally stops people in their tracks. You know, when you get infected, you get very sick. There's no such thing as an asymptomatic Ebola infection. People are very limited almost instantly in their movements. So it makes it, on that basis alone, more difficult to transmit it to other people. Secondly, from the standpoint of shall we say, people's awareness or vigilance, it has such a horrific reputation, and rightfully so, that people will stay away of their own volition of anyone who is even rumored to have Ebola. And so you don't have to educate people to wear masks and be careful if they're around people that might have this new disease. They know to stay away. Ebola is also a bloodborne virus. It means that the diagnostic tests are actually more straightforward to develop. So in Africa, when we had a suspect Ebola patient that would come to the triage area of an Ebola treatment unit, we would just have them sit in a chair, do a little pinprick of their finger, and within 15 minutes, we would have a test that told us whether they had Ebola or not. So we had very, very rapid diagnostic testing that we could deploy widely. So because we had good public awareness, because we had good diagnostic rapid testing, we could do effective contact tracing, even in one of the world's poorest countries. So contact tracing for a disease like Ebola is a lot more straightforward. Now, how does that differ from COVID-19? Well, anyone who can read an American newspaper can see how hard it has been to control COVID-19. The thing that we did not know about COVID-19 when it first showed up was that there would be so many asymptomatic cases, and that at least a small percentage of those asymptomatic cases could in fact transmit the disease and result in so-called super spreader events before we even sort of had a handle that the event even happened. The other thing about COVID-19 is most cases are in fact relatively mild, and that kind of lowers, unfortunately, public perception of the seriousness of this disease. It requires another level of thinking to know that, yes, most cases are mild, but if the infection is extremely widespread, even a 1% or fraction of 1% mortality still means that there will be many deaths. And when people don't see sick people around them and they haven't heard within their own circle of seriously ill people, they start to let down their guard and go so far as to say, well, you know, wearing masks and so forth is not important. So honestly, for all those reasons, I'll go back to what I said. I would rather take and try to handle an outbreak of a disease like Ebola any day over having another COVID-19 pandemic.
Well, that's a tough Sophie's choice. Is that what you call that?
Yes, it is. But I mean, from the broader standpoint of the greatest number being affected and the ability to actually stamp it out. You know,
Right.
the Democratic Republic of the Congo has more experience than any country. They've had something like 12 Ebola epidemics. It is not a wealthy country. They have managed to stamp out every single Ebola epidemic, you know, obviously with some external help, but they have a tremendous amount of expertise and have kept those outbreaks of Ebola within their own borders.
So I want to switch back, Penny, to you. You talked a little earlier about explaining things to kids, and I've read a few of your books. I've read Mosquitoes Don't Bite. I've read the COVID book, and they really are terrific. Um, these are tough subjects to talk about, and malaria, which is what you deal with in Mosquitoes Don't Bite, is an extremely awful disease. Um, a lot of this is very frightening. Many of us have children and grandchildren, and we know that they're scared. They don't know if they should play and touch the equipment in the playground and all that kind of stuff. How do you thread that needle to give children facts that are truthful and are accurate, in a sense of maybe empowering them rather than terrifying them?
Well, that's a really good question. And when we were doing this COVID book and the club, one decision we made was that we would talk about a lot of numbers about cases, but not deaths. So that was just one approach. We did a survey of the kids who went through the book club at the end and asked them about whether they were less or more anxious about COVID afterwards. And about 75% of them said they were less anxious, and nobody said they were more anxious. So I do think that giving people information helps them, but we also surround it with a lot of discussion, dialogue between the characters, and, you know, we talk about concerns for family members' safety and that sort of thing, but we try to keep the overall feeling positive that people have always overcome these kinds of diseases and challenges in the past, and they will again this time. And in a sense, that was one of the reasons for doing the book also, was to give a sense of perspective. And Leo talks about this a little bit when he talked to kids at the book club. You know, the 1918 flu was much more serious in terms of the number of people it killed, and there was much less that we could do about it. Now we know so much more, that these times should be a time when we all come together and work together and devote ourselves to real facts instead of misinformation, and think for ourselves and know that scientific knowledge is proceeding all the time. So that's the approach we take.
So this is a question for both of you, but since you've got the stage, you stay right where you are. Where do you think formal science education falls short? And how do you see informal education, which includes reading, although it's not exclusive for that, filling the gap?
Well, I spend a lot of time in this because I chair an organization called STEM Next, which is all about after-school science nationally. In terms of some things that are left out of formal science education standards at the moment, in the NGSS, there's nothing about viruses, vaccines, there's nothing about the CDC or the WHO, and there's very little about teaching kids how to sort out real information from fake information. So those are all areas that I think are missing in K-12 education now. A talented teacher can definitely cover those things, but if they are really just worrying about fulfilling the expectations in the standards, they may not. So one big advantage of informal science is it's much more flexible. It doesn't have to follow the NGSS. It doesn't have to worry about the tests at the end of the course. It can really focus on things that might be of interest to kids. So that's the second real advantage is in terms of engagement. Museum visits, clubs, science experiments that you do at home, nature exploration, drawing nature, are all things that kids will do because they really want to do them. And there's a lot of free choice. That's another way of talking about out of school experiences or informal is free choice science. So that's a way to really increase kids' interests and also their sense of identity of themselves as scientists. And I'll just say that that is one of the real purposes of Tumble Home Learning is we want kids to get excited about science through reading adventures. And we want them to start identifying with the characters in the books who are carrying out science so that they can see themselves as scientists.
Leo, you have anything to add in that?
I'm rendered speechless. I honestly don't have much to add to what Penny has to say. Obviously, I don't encounter children much in my day-to-day work. Probably the closest equivalent is trying to explain, disease conditions, prognoses, treatments, and so forth to concerned family members of my patients. And that does take a certain amount of experience and being able to translate scientific concepts to a more general audience, quite often ones without an audience without much education, whose primary language, at least in the communities where I work, often is not English.
Well, while I have you, though, one of our questions that's come in for you is you've obviously had lots of experience with infectious diseases, and I'm sure that you read all Penny's books. Are there some stories that you want her to tell that she hasn't gotten to yet? This would be a good time to let her know.
Oh my gosh, you're putting me on the spot. Honestly, probably in one way or another, I probably told her those because, if I've had an exciting day at work or a fascinating case, it's hard for me not to talk about that to Penny, since she is a doctor and knowledgeable about my work at dinner time. She's covered a lot of bases, at least within infectious diseases. There is another area that does fascinate me, and that is the ability to kind of read the past or read into the past using molecular techniques. So a good example of this is being able to isolate and sequence ancient DNA to learn more about the origins of humans, how we're related to the Denisovans, and how many of us, at least from continental Europe or East Asia, have a little bit of Neanderthal in us. But I think it was Michelle that actually said that pandemics have existed throughout recorded time and history. The fact is, we obviously had infectious diseases before that as well. And believe it or not, some of these ancient pathogens or vestiges of them can be recovered from things like archaeological sites. And so, being able to, for example, attempt to deduce the actual cause of death of King Tut, having found malarial parasites or other things, in his mummy is pretty interesting. But sometimes, because we can actually compare these ancient DNA sequences to modern ones, we can actually look at these sequences as a form of a molecular clock. And that actually gives us information about what is actually happening to these pathogens, how are they evolving and adapting to the modern world, and a world that is dominated by our species. And I'm not sure Penny has written about that yet, but it is one that's at least informally interesting to me when I don't have to do the kind of work that I'm actually doing.
That's the molecular biology for fifth graders is not something I've really figured out how to do yet.
Yeah, that's a tall order.
Although we have published a nice book about stem cells, which is for grades 3 to 5, written by a former medical school professor of ours who's a famous stem cell researcher. So sometimes I can just hope that I'll find someone else to write some of these books.
Well, I'm going to put in a vote for what Leo just suggested. I think that would be amazing. So I have one last question. It's a pretty long one, so I'm going to read it to you that's come in to us. We'd like to hear from both of you. I think we have just about 3 minutes left. Many children in this country live lives that are insulated from the perils of the more impoverished places in the world, or are indigent themselves and never have had the opportunity to see the world outside of their immediate environment. What kind of message would you like to convey to increase global understanding?
We were privileged that we could travel, and so one of the things we certainly did with our children was to take them to many places that would lead them to understand their privilege. But it definitely is a theme of the books that I write, or the gas books, and Mosquitoes Don't Bite Me. There are places where people have a lot less. Is it fair? What can one do about it? Those were themes that came up in the Mosquitoes Don't Bite Me book. So I think I just wanted to show you this other book, by the way. Since you have a makerspace, this is one of my books that's nonfiction, Inventors, Makers, Barrier Breakers. And it has a very diverse set of inventors in there, like the 2 first women millionaires in the self-earned millionaires in the US were African-American women who developed hair products. So it's a very diverse book. There's a lot of diverse inventors and makers in here. So one message is, you can do anything, you can be anything, you can develop a life of excitement and adventure. And the other is, yes, the world has a lot of differences and a lot of places that are hard and a lot of problems that are going on. So there's a lot of room for kids to help. Now I left Leo about 30 seconds.
I would respond, I think, from the perspective, I think, of the parent that wrote the question and thinking about how to expose our children to, shall we say, diversifying experiences. And what I would say is, you don't have to go to an exotic, far away, country, third world or otherwise. We have extremes of socioeconomic disparity right in our own country, and to which many of us who live in more privileged or secluded environments may not get exposed to. But I would say, I think it's a good thing to expose children to those areas and those pockets of real poverty and, shall we say, marginalized populations right within our own country, because I can certainly say that we have something akin to third world conditions when it comes to healthcare availability, lifespan, and other things that are in many ways comparable to some of the poor countries, say in sub-Saharan Africa that I've mentioned, right here in our own country. Those of us who live, or as we did, in a suburb, sometimes we have exchange programs where we have minority students coming to our schools and being bussed out. But I would actually ask the parents of those suburban children, well, how many times have you actually sent your kids to go in and spend some time in the inner city? Have they ever spent a night overnight in an inner city household? It's, I think, a very eye-opening experience, and I think parents should have the courage to allow their children to have that kind of experience, and then see what kinds of questions arise from your children and take it from there.
Well, thank you very much. This was a lot of fun to listen to you, and I think I need to turn this back to Michelle now.
Yeah, thank you. Leo and Penny, I appreciate your time sharing your experiences with us this evening. Eva, thank you for following along on the questions that people were submitting. fascinating things to think about. I also want to thank our generous sponsors of Discovery Space, Penn State Health, Geisinger, Yorsch Popek, Center Eye Physicians and Surgeons. Future events in this series are being planned for early 2021. Please visit discoveryspace.org to find out more. Have a good night. Thanks.